Ah, I see you're here. At last. I felt your presence even before you crossed the threshold. Time seems to stretch out here, doesn't it? As if every minute dragged on, heavy and cumbersome. This is often the case in places where so many souls have wandered, lost between this world and the other. The crackle of fire? You can hear it, can't you? A little too loud, perhaps, for such a small fire. But it has its own way of occupying space. Like everything else here, it lives off its surroundings. From you, perhaps. Oh, I wouldn't want to frighten you. Not yet, anyway. You chose to be here, after all. How brave. Or is it recklessness? It doesn't really matter. What matters is that you're here. And that I'm here to guide you. To tell you what others would rather not say. Make yourselves comfortable. And listen. It's not every day you get to hear the murmurings of the shadows. You'll be surprised at what they have to say. The manor staircase. Strange how a simple set of stairs can hide so much horror, isn't it? Yet this is where it all began. James and Rebecca Whitlock should never have moved into this old mansion. They both knew it. It was madness, but old Aunt Clara's inheritance had enabled them to buy what they thought was a restoration project. A bargain, they said. A little piece of history to bring back to life. If only they'd known what awaited them. From the very first night, something was wrong. The kind of thing you can't really name, but you feel it in the air, in the way the shadows move a little too fast, a little too quietly. They heard creaks in the walls, icy drafts brushing against them, even though all the windows were closed. But worst of all was the crying. Those muffled, distant sobs that echoed up the main staircase every night. A sound you could easily ignore the first time, telling yourself the wind was playing tricks. But when that same sound resounds, night after night, with the same intensity, always in the same place, you begin to doubt. James wasn't superstitious. He put it down to the old foundations, the damp. He was a man of reason, after all. But Rebecca, she felt something else. She said this crying couldn't be just the sound of a house working. There was a pain, a distress in that sound, as if a child was begging for its life. But every time they turned on the lights, every time James came downstairs to inspect, nothing. Just silence. A heavy, almost suffocating silence. And then there was that night, the night everything changed. Rebecca had woken up in a sweat, a lump in her throat. The silence, it was too oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. Then, suddenly, the noise burst forth. Crying, this time louder, heartbreaking, from the depths of the staircase. A terrifying echo that seemed to rise from the walls, the floors, as if the whole structure were groaning. James stood up abruptly, grabbing a flashlight. "That's enough!" he shouted, heading for the stairs. Rebecca begged him not to go. Something horrible was lurking there, she was sure of it. But James, implacable, went down. He advanced slowly, each step creaking under his feet. The crying seemed to grow louder as he went deeper into the darkness. But this time, it was different. The sound was no longer distant. It was very close, right in front of him. As if someone was there, just out of reach of the light. As he reached the last step, James froze. In front of him, at the bottom of the stairs, stood a child. A little boy, his hair wet, his skin as pale and icy as death itself. His eyes, oh, his eyes, they were empty, black as night. "Help me," he whispered, in a breath that seemed to come from the very depths of hell. James recoiled instinctively. "It can't be," he he thought, trying to rationalize what he was seeing. But the child stepped forward. "Help me, or you'll never leave." The lamp flickered, then abruptly went out. The crying stopped, giving way to a morbid silence. It was as if the air around James were growing denser, pulling him down towards the boy with the empty stare. Rebecca, at the top of the stairs, shouted his name, but James didn't move. The next morning, Rebecca woke up alone. She looked all over the house for James, but he was nowhere to be found. The staircase, that cursed staircase, seemed to have swallowed him up. But there was something else. The crying. It had changed. It was no longer a child's voice. No, it was James's, weak, broken, pleading. Every night, in the same place, the same torment. And Rebecca? She couldn't take it for long. A few months later, they found her, collapsed at the foot of the stairs. Her face scarred by terror, her lips frozen in a silent scream. Since then, they say, if you venture into this mansion after midnight, you can still hear the cries. But now it's two voices, a man and a child, trapped in the same eternal nightmare. So, if you ever pass this way, remember this. Never go down the stairs after sunset. You don't know who's waiting for you down there, or if you'll ever come back up. They thought they'd found their dream home. Sarah and Paul, a perfectly normal couple, had finally bought their first home. A charming old building, a little dilapidated, but full of potential. You know, the kind of house you'd imagine lovingly restored, room by room. It was their project, their future. But they should have known better. They should never have opened that door. Everything was fine at first. The first few weeks were perfect. Friends came to visit, complimented the house's old-fashioned charm, and renovation plans fell into place. But there was one room they hadn't visited yet. When they had bought the house, the previous owner, a rather odd old man, had told them that the back room was condemned. "Don't worry about it. It's been sealed up for years," he'd whispered, almost with relief. Sarah and Paul didn't care too much. After all, they had plenty of other work to do, and no reason to worry about a sealed room. But you know how it is. The more people tell you not to touch something, the more obsessed you get. And that sealed door, there it was, in their minds, always in the background. Sarah and Paul sometimes joked about it, but curiosity grew slowly. Then came that fateful day. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon. Paul, armed with a crowbar and a wry smile, finally decided to open the door. Sarah stood beside him, nervous but intrigued. It took them a few minutes to remove the wooden planks, sealing the entrance. Once the last plank had been removed, they were ready. Paul slowly turned the rusty handle, and the door opened with a sinister creak. Behind the door was a small room, barely larger than a closet. Nothing extraordinary at first glance. The walls were covered with old, torn wallpaper, and there was only one window, hidden by dusty curtains. But that was the feeling. An oppressive atmosphere. The air was icy, heavy, as if this room hadn't breathed in decades. Yet, there was something else. In a corner, half hidden beneath debris, Sarah noticed scratches on the floor, deep marks carved into the wood, as if someone or something had tried to get out, but had never succeeded. Paul, ever the pragmatist, shrugged. "Probably rats," he said with a nervous smile. But Sarah felt uncomfortable, very uncomfortable. Night fell quickly, and they decided to leave the room as it was for the time being, but the events of that night, that's when everything changed. At around 3 a.m., Sarah awoke with a start. She had heard a noise she couldn't ignore, a faint but persistent scratching coming from the other side of the house, from the condemned room. She woke Paul, who grunted and told her it was probably the wind or the old pipes. But she knew it was something else. There was something in that room. The next day, things got worse. The scratching returned, louder and louder, closer and closer. Then came the shadows. At first, mere furtive movements that they took for light effects. Then the shadows became sharper, more menacing. They seemed to be crawling along the walls, watching them. One night, Sarah thought she saw a thin, twisted figure standing by the bedroom door. She screamed, waking Paul, but when he turned on the light, there was nothing, just emptiness. But the air was frigid. And that scratching, always that damn scratching, louder and louder, as if something were desperately trying to get out. Paul decided to get it over with. He picked up a sledgehammer and declared he was going to destroy this room once and for all. He struck the walls, but with each blow the house seemed to protest, moaning like a living thing. And then, under one of the rotting wooden panels, they found a passage. A trapdoor hidden beneath the floor. It was small, narrow, as if hastily dug. Paul knelt down and opened it. What they found inside raised the horror to an unbearable level. Underneath, in a sort of small cavity, were remains. Bones, but not animal bones. Human bones, small, fragile, like those of a child. And among those bones was an ancient doll with glass eyes that seemed to stare back at them. Sarah let out a cry of horror, instinctively recoiling. Then the door to the room slammed shut, trapping them inside. The scratching sound that had haunted them became deafening. Paul rushed to the door, trying to open it, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding her back. Something waking up. The figure, the one Sarah had seen, materialized before them. A twisted form, its limbs elongated and deformed, a hideous face drawn by years of suffering and hatred. It advanced slowly, and with each step, the scratches on the floor seemed to reform, like an echo of what had once happened in this room. The thing drew nearer, and in a terrified whisper it uttered the words, "You've found me. Now it's your turn." What became of Sarah and Paul remains unclear. The house was found empty, their car still parked out front, but the room, the one they'd opened, it sealed again. And every full moon, if you drive by, they say you can still hear the scratching. The shadow under the bed. A child's fear, you think. One of those nightmares we forget as we grow up, rationalize over time. But sometimes those fears are there for a reason. Sometimes it's better never to look under the bed. Sarah and Julian had moved into a new house with their son, Lucas, just 6 years old. A warm, light-filled house, ideal for a family. Lucas loved his new room right away. Walls decorated with superheroes, toys scattered everywhere. Everything seemed perfect. But from the very first night, there was this scratching noise. This little noise, so discreet at first, which seemed to come from the floor, very close to Lucas's bed. Sarah thought it was the wind, maybe the old pipes. Julian, for his part, wasn't worried about it either. "A house that works," he said. But Lucas was different. He refused to get out of bed without the light on. He said there was someone under the bed. You know, with children, sometimes you have to take things lightly. Nightmares and imaginary fears are normal at this age. So Sarah and Julian said what every parent says, "There's nothing under the bed, darling. It's just your imagination." But Lucas insisted. Every night he said the same thing. "The shadow under the bed is watching me." At first, they thought it was just a phase, a story he told himself to keep from sleeping. But the problem was that Lucas was starting to change. He was becoming nervous, irritable, no longer wanting to stay alone in his room. He said the shadow was growing, getting closer. One night, when they thought he was asleep, Sarah and Julian were awakened by a scream, a howl of a terror they'd never heard before. They rushed into Lucas's room and found him curled up in a corner, trembling. He refused to return to his bed. "She tried to grab me. She reached out her hand," he said, sobbing. Sarah, worried, turned on the light and leaned over to check under the bed, just to reassure him. Nothing. No monster, no shadow, just a forgotten box of toys. "Look, Lucas, there's nothing here," she said, showing him. But Lucas shook his head. "Not when the light's on. She doesn't like light." That night, they left the light on, hoping it would calm him down. But that was only the beginning. Every night, Lucas seemed more and more frightened. He refused to sleep alone. He said the shadow was moving, that it slipped out of bed when he closed his eyes. "It's waiting for me to sleep," he whispered in a broken voice. Julian, annoyed, decided it was time to end it all. It was absurd. He lowered Lucas from the bed, turned on all the lights and said firmly, "There's nothing under this bed, and we're going to prove it." He bent down again to check under the bed, just as Sarah had done. But this time, something was different. The air was heavier, colder, and as Julian slid his gaze under the mattress, he caught sight of something. Just at the edge of his field of vision, a black shape. A shadow, but not the one on the toy box. He blinked, thinking his eyes were playing tricks, but they weren't. The shadow was moving. Very slowly, it seemed to stretch, to draw closer, and in a terrifying silence, Julian realized that this was no mere shadow. It was a figure, lean, twisted, with elongated arms that seemed to stretch out towards him. He leapt back, horrified, his heart beating wildly. Lucas was right! Sarah, shocked, took Lucas in her arms. "But what did you see?" she demanded, terrified. Julian, pale, tried to gather his thoughts. He turned on all the lights, searched the room from top to bottom. Nothing, not a trace, not a shadow. Nothing but that oppressive silence. Over the next few days, Lucas refused to sleep in his room. They made him sleep with them, thinking things would calm down. But things got worse. One night, Sarah woke with a start. There was a noise, the same scratching they'd heard under Lucas's bed, but this time it was in their own room. Slowly, terrified, she turned her head towards the bed. There, beneath the bed frame, she saw the shadow. Motionless, but palpable. She looked at it. Then, slowly, horribly, the shadow began to move, slowly slipping out of the darkness, stretching under the bed. Sarah screamed, and Julian flicked on the light. But the shadow was gone. They didn't know what to do. They consulted specialists, exorcists, but nothing worked. The shadow returned every night, and every night it seemed to get a little closer. One night, when the lights had accidentally gone out, Lucas, still lying in his parents' bed, whispered in an icy voice, "It's here! She's found me!" Sarah and Julian turned around in panic, but it was too late. The shadow had invaded the room, covering the floor, and this time it wasn't content to stay under the bed. It stood up, slowly, 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 a distorted, twisted figure with arms so long they seemed to drag across the floor, and she looked at them. The next morning the house was silent. When the neighbours didn't see anyone leave the house for several days, they called the police. The house was empty. But the investigators found something strange, Under every bed in the house, they discovered deep scratches, sinister marks, as if something had been there for a long time. And Lucas, Sarah, and Julian, they were never seen again. And now, if you hear noises under your bed, think twice before you look, because the shadow under the bed might be more real than you think. The house had always been silent until the music started. Emma and Julian had moved into a small house with a slightly old-fashioned charm, situated at the end of a quiet alley. It was one of those houses full of character, where every room seemed to have a story to tell. They loved the wooden floor that creaked under their feet, the large windows that let in the morning light. Everything seemed perfect. At least, it did at first. It was on a rainy weekend that it all began. Emma was rummaging through the attic, looking for old decorations she'd spotted on their first visit. The attic was cluttered with forgotten boxes, furniture covered in yellowed sheets, and the smell of old wood. Moving an old trunk, she discovered a dusty record player, a model from a bygone era. Intrigued, she brought it into the living room. "Look what I found," she said to Julian, who looked up from his book, a smirk on his face. "Do you think it still works?" he asked, one eyebrow raised. She shrugged. "There's only one way to find out." They plugged in the record player, and to their surprise, it worked. There was already a vinyl on it, a black record, without any label. Emma, curious, put down the needle. The silence was immediately replaced by an old melody, soft and melancholy, played on the piano, accompanied by a gentle murmur. The music seemed to come from another time, like a forgotten song resurfacing after decades. "Pretty, isn't it?" said Emma, letting herself be carried away by the notes. Julian nodded, but something about the melody made him uneasy. He couldn't say why, but there was something wrong. That evening, after listening to the record several times, they went upstairs to bed. But the night was not peaceful. Emma awoke with a start, her heart beating wildly. There was this sound, music, distant but familiar. It was the piano, the same melody as on the record. She shook Julian. "Can you hear that?" Julian, still half asleep, listened intently. Yes, it was the same song. But how? They'd turned off the record player before going upstairs. "Maybe it's the wind, or an old pipe," he murmured, rolling over to go back to sleep. But Emma couldn't ignore what she was hearing. The melody seemed to repeat itself over and over, growing louder with each loop. She got up, went downstairs to the living room, and found the record player on, the needle dancing on the vinyl, even though neither of them had turned it on. Her blood ran cold. She approached slowly, unplugging the record player with a jerk. The music stopped immediately, plunging the house into an oppressive silence. "Julian!" she shouted up the stairs, but he didn't answer. Entering the bedroom, she found him still asleep, but restless. He was muttering incomprehensible words, his face twisted in a grimace of terror. "Julian, wake up!" she cried, shaking him violently. He suddenly opened his eyes, panting, his gaze lost. "I saw her," he said, his voice trembling. "Who?" "The woman. She was there, by the record player. She was looking at me." Emma felt chilled to the bone. Julian had never had nightmares, let alone ones like this. But this was just the beginning. In the days that followed, the melody continued to haunt the house. Every evening they could hear the piano echoing in the walls, even when the record player was unplugged. And then there was that presence, a shadow, fleeting, barely perceptible, but more and more real each time. Emma sometimes felt a cold breath on the back of her neck, a heaviness in the air, as if someone were standing right behind her. Then, one evening, as the melody resounded louder than ever, they decided to turn off the record player for good. Julian grabbed the vinyl and tried to destroy it. But as the record shattered, a scream echoed through the house. A piercing, inhuman scream of pure terror. The light suddenly went out. They stood frozen in the darkness, their hearts beating wildly. Then, slowly, the melody began again. Louder, closer. In the flickering glow of the flashlights, they saw something materialize in the shadows of the living room. A silhouette, that of a woman. Her eyes empty, her hair falling in damp strands over her face, her clothes torn. She approached, almost floating, her gaze fixed on them. Julian stepped back, trembling. It's her. It's her. I saw in my dream. Emma, paralyzed with fear, couldn't look away from the apparition. The woman opened her mouth, but no sound came out except the melody. The same melody played over and over again, and that's when they understood. This music wasn't just some forgotten song. It was a call from beyond, an echo of the woman who had been trapped there, in that house, condemned to repeat the same scene, the same tragedy. And now she had found them. Julian tried to reach out to Emma to pull her away, but as he reached out, the woman disappeared. The record player faded out, plunging the house into complete silence. They thought it was over, that the song had been broken. But the next morning, when Emma awoke, she didn't find Julian at her side. She went downstairs to the living room, her heart pounding, and there she saw him. Julian, sitting in front of the record player, staring blankly, needle poised over a new record, a black record with no label, and the melody, that cursed melody, over and over again, uninterrupted. She approached, tears in her eyes. "Julian, please stop." But Julian turned to her, his face livid, a twisted smile stretching his lips. "She made me listen to her song," he murmured in a husky, foreign voice. "Now it's yours." The house by the lake. It almost sounded like a dream, didn't it? A peaceful place, isolated from the noise of the world, where you could hear the waves gently licking the shore, the wind blowing through the trees. That's exactly what Laura and Thomas were thinking when they signed the papers. Their perfect little home, far away from it all, the place where they could recharge their batteries, escape the hustle and bustle of the city. But what they hadn't counted on was her. It began slowly, like all these stories. The kind of details you hardly notice at first, a shadow in the reflection of the lake, a silhouette in the distance that you mistake for a play of light. But plays of light don't always stand in the same place day after day. And above all, they don't look at you. The first evening, still in the middle of unpacking, Laura and Thomas collapsed on the sofa, exhausted but happy. Looking out the window, Laura saw her for the first time, a woman standing by the lake. She was wearing a white dress, slightly faded. Her hair seemed to stick to her face, as if it was soaked. Laura's first thought was of a stroller, a neighbour perhaps. But there was something strange in the way she remained motionless, facing the house. "Tom, look," Laura said, pointing to the figure. Thomas leaned over, squinting. But when he looked, the woman had disappeared. "Probably someone wandering around," he said, shrugging. Laura, for her part, wasn't convinced, but let it go. After all, they'd just arrived, so perhaps fatigue was playing on her nerves. In the days that followed, the figure reappeared. Always in the same place, always at the same time, just after sunset. Every evening, Laura watched it through the living room window, hypnotized. The woman remained there, silent, motionless, staring at the house without ever moving. But as soon as Thomas came to see her, she disappeared. After a week, Laura couldn't stand it any longer. She had to know. One night she went outside. It was cold, much colder than usual. The wind seemed to carry the smell of stagnant water, heavy and suffocating. Laura walked slowly towards the edge of the lake, her heart beating faster and faster. She knew the figure would be there. She could feel it in her gut, and indeed it was there. Closer this time. Her eyes, oh God, her eyes, black, empty, like two chasms that seemed to suck in all light. The woman looked at her without a word, without a movement. "What are you doing here?" asked Laura, her voice trembling. The woman didn't answer, but she moved, just a little. She raised a hand, a slow gesture, as if in a dream. Laura instinctively followed the direction indicated. She looked at the lake, and that's where she saw it. Just below the surface, a few meters from the shore, a dark mass was floating, hair floating like seaweed. Laura stepped back in horror. The thing under the water, it was a body, a woman's body, identical to the one before her. She screamed and ran towards the house. When she told Thomas everything, he took her in his arms, trying to calm her down, but she could see he didn't believe her. "There's no one there, Laura. It's just your imagination. We're tired, the move, all that. It's playing tricks on you." But Laura knew what she'd seen, and she knew that woman would be back. The next night, Laura woke up in a sweat. Something was wrong. She felt a presence, this heavy, oppressive sensation, as if someone was standing in the room. Turning her head, she saw the woman's silhouette standing at the foot of the bed, her clothes dripping water, leaving a dark pool on the floor. Laura screamed. Thomas leapt from the bed, but the figure had already disappeared. They searched the whole house, every room, every nook and cranny. They found nothing, no sign of intrusion, no trace of water. But Laura knew she hadn't been dreaming. The woman was there, watching them, waiting. The days became waking nightmares. Laura saw her everywhere. In the reflection of the windows, by the lake, behind the trees. The woman never spoke, just stared at the house, at her, like a silent accusation. And then there was the last night. Laura, exhausted, had fallen asleep early, but something woke her. It wasn't a noise, it was a sensation, a presence, heavy, cold, pressed against her. She opened her eyes, and there it was, lying beside her in bed. Soaking wet, her empty black eyes staring at Laura just inches away. The woman's mouth opened slowly, like an endless chasm, and in an icy whisper she said, "You have to come. Now." Laura screamed, but it was too late. She felt a force pulling her out of bed, carrying her away, dragging her toward the lake. Thomas awoke just in time to see her open the door and walk, as if in a trance, towards the water. He rushed to catch up, but something held him back. The air around him turned icy, heavy, and the woman's silhouette materialized in front of him, blocking his path. The next morning, they found Laura by the lake. Her body floated, stiff and frozen, her eyes open, staring back at the house. And ever since, every night, a new silhouette appears at the edge of this lake. Blood wedding. It's funny how empty that phrase can sound when you first hear it. But here, in this castle, the words take on their full meaning. And believe me, once you understand what happened, you'll never look at weddings in the same way again. It was 1864, a bitterly cold winter. The kind of winter where the air bites you to the bone and every breath seems a struggle to stay alive. That evening, Windcliff Castle was lit up like never before. It was the big event, the wedding of Lady Eleanor and Baron Adrian Ashford, a wealthy, mysterious man who, according to rumours, had never lost his coldness. The ceremony had been splendid. Lady Eleanor, in her white dress, was resplendent. A true jewel, surrounded by noble guests who laughed, drank, and celebrated this union that was to seal two of the country's most powerful families. Servants rushed about, wine goblets filled, and the banquet seemed never-ending. But despite all this opulence, a shadow hung over the event. A tension, something devious that snaked between the ancient walls. You see, Eleanor had never wanted this wedding. Her eyes betrayed it. She was young, beautiful, full of life, whereas Baron Ashford, he was much older, and worse, he had no heart. Not for her, anyway. It was an arranged marriage, an alliance, a union dictated by fortune, not love. Eleanor knew this, and it terrified her. But she had no choice. She married him. The wedding night finally arrived, and the guests began to withdraw, leaving the castle bathed in a strange, almost spectral atmosphere. Only the muffled sounds of horses' hooves, doors slamming in the distance, and the wind whistling through the walls remained. That's when things took a turn. A bloody turn. No one knows exactly what happened in that room that night. But rumour has it that the servants, the ones who were still up in the wee hours of the morning, heard screams, high-pitched, piercing screams from the bridal apartments. Screams of terror, of pure horror. Yet none dared move. Who would have had the audacity to disturb Baron Ashford? The next morning, the room was silent. The curtains were drawn, and a strange mist floated through the castle corridors. But Eleanor never appeared. Some guests whispered that she had fled in the night, others that she had been seized by a sudden illness. As for the Baron, he remained impassive, cold as ever. He explained that Lady Eleanor was resting in need of tranquility after an eventful night, but something in his tone, something in his eyes was blood-curdling. Days passed, and Lady Eleanor remained invisible. Tension mounted among the servants, each avoiding to ask the question on everyone's lips. Where was the bride? Then, one morning, while cleaning the grand staircase, a maid noticed something strange. A tiny, almost imperceptible red stain at the bottom of the carved wooden banister. A drop of blood. Intrigued, she followed it up the stairs one by one until she reached the bridal chamber. The blood intensified with every step. And when she finally pushed open the door, the room was pitch dark, but there was a smell, a heavy, metallic smell. The air itself seemed sticky, oppressive. And there, on the bed, Lady Eleanor, or at least what was left of her. Her body was stretched out, still dressed in her wedding gown, but her skin, it was white as snow. Not a natural whiteness, no, a whiteness of death, a macabre whiteness. Her veins, dark and twisted, stood out like rivers of darkness beneath her diaphanous flesh. But it was her eyes that provoked the maid's screams. Her sockets were open, but empty, completely hollowed out, as if someone had ripped them out. Blood, oh, was everywhere. Traces of struggle, spatter on the walls, on the floor, but not a sound, as if time itself had stood still in this room of horror. Baron Ashford was never questioned. No one had the courage to confront the man, but after that night he withdrew completely from the world. Guests never returned. The castle, once so lively, sank into icy desolation. It's said that sometimes you can still hear the echoes of the wedding, the laughter of guests, the murmur of toasts, but also the screams of a bride sacrificed on the altar of power and greed. But that's not all. Years later, when the chateau was reopened for renovation, the workmen, digging under the foundations, came across a small secret crypt. There, in a silver coffin, they found Eleanor, her body perfectly preserved. But this time, she had eyes. 2 black globes, dark as the abyss, that seemed to be watching, spying, watching for the moment when someone else would dare awaken the nightmare. And now, they say, anyone who lays eyes on that coffin ends up hearing whispers at night, wedding promises, muffled laughter, and in the morning, a wedding dress stained with blood. The first time they heard the noises coming from the attic, they thought it was the old wooden floorboards at work. It was an old house, after all. Sarah and Max had just moved into this charming Victorian mansion, hoping to start a new life away from the city, in the tranquility of a small town. But the tranquility, it wasn't there. The house seemed almost alive. Every night there were creaks and squeaks, like whispers in the walls. Max wasn't worried. "It's normal in an old house," he repeated. But Sarah felt something else. She didn't mention it at first, but there was a constant tension in the air. A presence, something watching her. You know, that feeling that you're never really alone, even when no one's around. And then there was that noise, a light noise, but constant, like a gentle scratching, coming from somewhere above their bedroom, from the attic. The first night, they ignored it. But on subsequent nights, it became louder, more distinct. It was as if someone, or something, was moving up there, slowly, methodically. Sarah began to have nightmares. She'd wake up in a sweat, convinced that something was watching them from the ceiling. But every time Max went up to check, he couldn't find anything. One evening, as they were watching TV, a thud was heard. This time, it wasn't just discreet creaking. It was a violent shock, as if something had been moved suddenly. "That's enough," Max growled, rising to his feet. "I'll go and have a look." He climbed the stairs to the attic, flashlight in hand, his face tense. Sarah followed reluctantly. She had this oppressive feeling, as if every step they took brought them closer to something unspeakable, something waiting for them. The attic door was heavy and dusty, as if it hadn't been opened in years. Max forced open the handle with a sinister creak. The air inside was frigid, much colder than in the rest of the house. A rancid smell wafted through, a mixture of damp wood and something else, something darker. They turned on the light. The attic was vast, cluttered with old trunks, furniture covered with yellowed sheets and dusty cardboard boxes. Nothing seemed to be moving, but the heavy silence only heightened Sarah's anxiety. "Nothing here," Max said, almost relieved. But Sarah remained frozen. Something was wrong. Something was wrong. Then she saw it. In a corner, behind an old piece of furniture, there were marks, deep scratches on the wooden floor. "Max, look at this," she said in a trembling voice. Max stepped closer, shining his lamp on the marks. It was clear. Someone, or something, had been there. The scratches were old, but fresh in places, as if recently reactivated. Then they heard this sound, a slight rubbing, a gasp, coming from below. "It can't be," Max murmured. He bent down to lift one of the old carpets covering the attic floor. Underneath, a trap door. It seemed to have been hidden on purpose, but something had pushed it aside. The handle was rusty, but Max grabbed it and after a moment's hesitation, opened it. Underneath, there was a void, a hollowed-out, dark space with a metal ladder leading down. Max's lamp trembled slightly as he illuminated it. "We shouldn't go down there," Sarah murmured. Her instincts were screaming. But Max, stubborn, shook his head. "I want to know what's going on." He descended slowly, the ladder creaking with every movement. Sarah remained at the top, anxiously watching Max's light descend further. Eventually, he reached the bottom and swept the dirt floor with his lamp. Then he froze. "Sarah, you should see this." His tone had changed. There was no longer the slightest trace of bravado in his voice. Trembling, she went downstairs. At the bottom, she discovered a small room, dug directly into the ground, like a hiding place. But that wasn't what terrified her. In the centre of the room, there was a small, worn wooden chair, and on top of it, an old doll. But not just any doll. It looked strangely like a child, with wispy hair, dull glass eyes, and scratches on its face. Fresh scratches, as if something or someone had tried to tear her from the chair. That's when they heard the laughter. A light, almost childish, but twisted laugh echoing in that small room. Sarah turned, and there, in a dark corner of the room, a silhouette took shape. Small, thin, curved. She was smiling. Max rushed to the ladder, shouting at Sarah to follow him. They climbed as fast as they could, but behind them the laughter was getting closer, the scratching, the rubbing. It had never been in the attic. It had been here, under the house, all this time. And now it was awake. Back in the attic, Max slammed the hatch and locked it, breathing heavily. But they knew it was only a matter of time before it rose again. They never spoke again of what they'd seen. They sold the house quickly, claiming they wanted to move for work. But since then, Sarah dreams every night of the silhouette, of that muffled laughter echoing in the walls. What about the new family living in the house now? They say their son often talks about an imaginary friend who lives in the attic. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, they hear noises coming from below. Hargrave Manor, a name almost forgotten in history, buried under years of silence. Yet something far more sinister than time has haunted it. The kind of place where even the walls seem to hold their breath. Laura and Paul had recently moved in, happy to afford this old house in secluded countryside. It was love at first sight. A large garden, spacious rooms, and that slightly dilapidated air that made them feel as if they'd acquired a piece of history. But Hargrave's history, it wasn't quite ready to be forgotten. The first few weeks were calm, almost idyllic. Their son, 6-year-old Emilien, seemed to adapt perfectly to his new room, a bright space overlooking the garden. But Laura felt something peculiar, like a weight in the air. It was subtle at first, barely perceptible. Whispers in the wind, perhaps, or that strange feeling of being watched as she passed through certain corridors. Then came the noises. It began softly, like a slight rubbing, a vibration on the steps of the main staircase. She first noticed it in the evening, after she'd put Emilien to bed. Every night, at the same time, she heard footsteps, small steps, like a child running. But when she got up to check, Emilien was fast asleep in his bed. "Are you sure it's not him?" laughed Paul, amused by her concerns. "Old houses always crack, you know that." Laura wanted to believe it. After all, it was plausible, wasn't it? the wood working, the drafts. Yet every night, those footsteps returned, always more precise, more insistent, as if someone were going up and down the stairs without ever finishing. She tried to ignore the phenomenon, but this became impossible when the footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. It was a moonless night, black and silent. Laura had woken with a start, her eyes fixed on the bedroom door. The footsteps were still echoing, but this time they weren't followed by those little sounds of descending. No. They had stopped just in front of Emilian's room at the top of the stairs. Laura got up slowly, slipping out of bed without waking Paul. She opened the door slowly, her heart pounding in her temples. All seemed quiet. But there, in the shadow of the stairs, she saw him. A small figure stood motionless at the top of the stairs. A child, thin, his hair a mess, dressed in a dark garment. The face... Oh, Laura couldn't see it clearly. Too many shadows. Her heart raced, but she didn't move. Her legs seemed frozen to the ground, as if her body refused to obey the growing terror inside her. "Emilian?" she whispered, not daring to raise her voice. There was no reply. The figure stood there, perfectly still. She took a step forward, her legs trembling, but as the corridor light flickered, the child slowly turned his head towards her. It wasn't Emilien. No, this face was foreign. The dark eyes, devoid of all humanity, stared back at her with icy intensity. Then, with a sudden jerk, the figure disappeared into the darkness as if it had never been there. Laura rushed into Emilian's room. He was sleeping peacefully, his little body curled up under the covers, oblivious to the horror that had just unfolded a few feet away. She stood there for a long moment, her breath short, watching her son sleep, reassured to see him safe. But this was only the beginning. Every night the footsteps began again, and every night they stopped in the same place, at the top of the stairs. Laura sometimes saw the shadow of that child, just standing there, staring at her with those lifeless black eyes. She told Paul about it, but he didn't believe her. "You're imagining things," he repeated. "It's just your imagination." But Laura knew. She knew something was wrong. One night, as the footsteps echoed again, Laura decided to end it all. She silently descended the stairs, but this time she didn't find the child. Instead, she noticed something she'd never seen before, an old door hidden beneath the steps, barely visible, concealed by faded wallpaper. Heart pounding, she approached. The door was small, low enough for only a child to squeeze through. The rusty handle resisted for a moment, but eventually gave way. An icy breath escaped from the opening, and a heavy silence fell over the house. Behind the door, a narrow staircase led to an unfamiliar underground room. She turned on her flashlight, cautiously descending the stairs. At the bottom was a small, empty room, except for an old wooden chest. Laura approached, hands trembling, and slowly opened the chest. Inside, toys and children's clothes, all old and dusty, as if time had stood still. And at the bottom, a small metal box, rusty and dented. She opened it carefully, revealing yellowed newspaper clippings. "Mysterious disappearance at Hargrave Manor," read one of the headlines. 8-year-old unaccounted for after weeks of searching. The article described the disappearance of a young boy, abducted by his own family and locked away under the manor for obscure reasons. The body had never been found. Laura realized the terrible truth. That child she'd seen every night, the one going up and down the stairs, was no illusion. He was real, or at least what was left of him was. He was looking for something. He was looking for someone. As she closed the box, an icy breath crossed the room. She turned slowly and saw him. The boy was there, standing in the shadows, the same dark eyes staring back at her. He stretched out his hand towards her, his fingers skinny, gaunt and trembling. Laura, paralyzed with fear, couldn't move. "It's you," he whispered in a weak voice, almost a breath. "It's you who must stay." And suddenly, everything went black. The next morning, Paul woke up alone in their bedroom. Laura had disappeared, as if she'd never been in the mansion. And that evening, when he heard small footsteps running up the stairs, he got up, trembling, to check. At the top of the stairs, he saw their son, Emilien, standing still. But this time, behind him, another figure was waiting. It was supposed to be a new life. Blackwood Manor, an immense building nestled in the heart of a dense forest, was exactly what Damien was looking for. A long-term restoration project, a place where he could finally settle down, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The place was old, of course, but its Gothic charm, high dusty windows and massive wooden staircase had everything to seduce. There was, however, one detail that had been mentioned in passing. Nothing serious, just an old piece of furniture left behind by the previous owners. A chair, they said, too damaged to be taken away. Damien paid it no mind. After all, what was a chair in such a vast manor? He'd discovered it the first day in the main salon, by the fireplace, faded and weathered. He left it there, telling himself he'd move it later. For the first few days, everything went smoothly. Damien took care of the odd job, cleaning the rooms one by one. But on the very first night, something disturbed him. In the middle of the night, he woke up to a slight creaking noise. He put his ear to it. It sounded like furniture being moved across the wooden floor. It was coming from the living room. He descended the stairs, still half asleep. The mansion was dark, and the dim light from his flashlight created moving shadows on the walls. When he reached the living room, he noticed that the chair that had been by the fireplace was no longer in the same place. It was now in the center of the room, facing him. He frowned in disbelief. "I must have moved it when I was cleaning," he muttered, searching for a rational explanation. He put it back in place and went back to bed, slightly disturbed, but not yet frightened. The next evening, the same noise occurred again. This time, he had fallen sound asleep, but the creaking woke him abruptly. The noise, identical to the previous days, echoed again from the living room. It sounded as if someone was dragging the chair across the wooden floor. Damien, his heart pounding, went downstairs more quickly this time, and there she was again, out of place, but this time facing the door, as if waiting for him. Goosebumps invaded his body. Something was wrong. He abruptly pushed her back against the wall. "It's just an old house creaking," he said to himself, trying to convince himself that it was all just a coincidence. But what happened the next night was different. Damien had sat down in front of the TV, hoping to relax after a long day's work. But no sooner had he put down the remote control than the creaking sound resounded again. This time, he didn't wait to get downstairs. He stepped cautiously into the living room, the noise intensifying as he approached. And then he saw the chair move. It slid slowly, all by itself, scraping the floor with a horrible creak. The worn wood screeched against the floor, and the chair moved centimetre by centimetre, as if an invisible force were pushing it. Damien stepped back, shocked, his legs trembling. "This can't be..." He rushed to the chair, grabbed it and lifted it back against the wall. His heart was pounding. He didn't know what to think. But that night, he couldn't sleep. The image of the chair moving on its own haunted his mind. The days that followed only intensified the situation. Every night the chair found itself moved, sometimes to places where he would never have left it. Once he found it in his own bedroom, facing his bed, as if someone had wanted to sit there and watch him while he slept. Damien couldn't take it anymore. He decided to research the manor's history. He discovered that the previous owners, an old, inward-looking family, had all mysteriously disappeared. One of the articles mentioned a child, a boy, who had spent years locked up in the manor, sitting in this very chair, punished for some obscure reason. The child was never seen again. Some said his spirit was still wandering the corridors, trying to find the place where he had spent his last days. Terrified, but determined to understand, Damien decided to end it all. That night, he sat down in the chair. "If it's you, show yourself," he whispered, his breath coming in short gasps. The lights flickered and the mansion seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, everything remained frozen in a deafening silence. Then, slowly, he felt an icy cold come over him. An invisible draught, heavy and oppressive, swept across the room. Damien felt a weight on his shoulders, a presence, that of a child sitting on his lap. Suddenly, a laugh sounded behind him, a weak, childish laugh, but twisted, distorted. He turned sharply, but there was no one there. Yet the weight remained there, heavy, pressing. Damien tried to stand up, but the chair wouldn't budge. It seemed to stick, to freeze. Then, slowly, the chair began to slide along the floor, taking him with it. It moved towards a dark corner of the living room where he had discovered the worn traces of his displacement. And there, in the half-light, something emerged. A child's figure, thin and twisted, staring at Damien with empty black eyes. The child leaned toward him and in a chilling breath whispered, "That's my seat. Let me sit down." The next day, the chair had returned to its original place by the fireplace, but Damien had disappeared. The Crookstone Manor. You've heard of it, haven't you? It's no urban legend. Oh no, it's much worse. There's a curse that's been lurking there for centuries, and it's linked to a simple servant, a poor man condemned to wander its corridors until his soul is finally appeased. But no one has ever figured out how to free him. And to be honest, I doubt anyone really wants to. It all begins in 1812, when the Hamilton family ruled Crookstone. It was a grand, sumptuous manor, but the grandeur was only a facade. The family patriarch, Sir Hamilton, was a cruel, manipulative man. He had amassed his wealth through betrayal, lies and violence, and at his side always stood his faithful servant, a man named William. A simple name, but what he became was anything but simple. William had devoted his entire life to serving this family, catering to their every whim. But the day Lady Margaret, Sir Hamilton's wife, died in strange circumstances, everything changed. You see, she had disappeared during a stormy night, her body never to be found. Some said she'd run away, others that she'd been the victim of an accident. But William knew the truth. That night, he'd seen something horrible. He had caught Sir Hamilton in Lady Margaret's room, a precious ring in his hand, a priceless ring that Lady Margaret always wore. Except that evening, the ring wasn't on her finger. It was clutched in Sir Hamilton's cold, rigid, blood-stained grip. William didn't know exactly what had happened, but he soon realized that Lady Margaret was never coming back. Fear gripped William, but also a deep sense of guilt. He knew there was nothing he could say. Sir Hamilton would never have hesitated to eliminate him if he had dared to speak out. So he remained silent. But the truth. Oh, it never stays buried for long in a place like Crookstone. Weeks went by, and strange things began to happen in the manor. Noises in the walls, shadows moving in the dark corridors. The servants avoided meeting the gaze of Sir Hamilton, who seemed to be sinking into madness. He often whispered his late wife's name, and at night could be heard wandering the rooms, talking to himself. Then one day, William disappeared. Just like that, without a trace. The other servants said he'd left the manor, that he'd finally plucked up the courage to flee. But that wasn't it. William would never have left without his pay. Not without the jewel stolen from Lady Margaret, the precious jewel Sir Hamilton had never found. The night William disappeared, the screaming began. Terrifying, almost inhuman screams, echoing through the manor every night at the same hour. The servants refused to leave their rooms after midnight, and those who did never returned. But the real horror was what happened to Sir Hamilton. One night he was found hanged in the great hall, his body spinning gently in the icy airstream. His eyes were wide open, frozen in an expression of pure terror. But that wasn't all. Around her neck was the ring. The same ring William had seen in Sir Hamilton's bloodied hands that fateful night. Someone or something had forced him to wear it before condemning him to this grotesque death. Since that day, William, or at least what's become of him, is said to still roam the manor. He is condemned to search for the ring, find it, and return it to his mistress. But what he's looking for is you. Because, you see, he can't find this jewel on his own. He needs someone to help him. And if he finds you, if you hear his footsteps, his whispers in the dark, you know what that means. They say that if you stay in Crookstone, you might catch a glimpse of William, his face twisted in despair, his skin cold and translucent. He's calling you, imploring you. And if you're stupid enough to answer, well, he'll take you with him, where he's taken so many others before you, but no one really knows where. You think the curse is only for Crookstone, that as long as you never set foot in this mansion, you're safe. But you're wrong, because in recent years, word has it that William no longer confines himself to the walls of Crookstone. He's started looking elsewhere. So when you hear strange noises at night, or if a jewel suddenly appears in your house, don't touch it. Just don't touch it. Because that jewel could very well be Lady Margaret's, the one William is begging you to find. And if you have it in your possession, William will come for you. And once he's found you, believe me, he'll never let you go.